When Eric Miller is rushed to the hospital a second time for a mysterious illness, doctors would find a deadly level of arsenic in his system, but by the time they found it, it would already be too late. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to my channel and Killer Concepts, the place where we talk about all things true crime. My name is Peyton. If you are new here, please make sure to hit that red subscribe button down below and turn on your post notifications so you do not miss any future content. Today we are going to be talking about a poisoning case. Guess what gender the poisoner is? Female. If you have watched my other videos on poisoning cases, then you know this seems to be a preferred method for women when it comes to murder. More specifically, we are going to be talking about the murder of a man named Eric Miller, who was poisoned by his wife Ann Miller Kontz and her lover. I do want to clarify very quickly, Ann Miller Kontz's last name is spelled K-O-N-T-Z. I just don't want anyone to think I am saying something vulgar, because this is legitimately her last name now. As usual, we will start by talking about who Eric and Ann were, how they met, and their relationship. All sources for this video will be down below in the description box. I just want to point it out because I may not mention all of them out loud and they all deserve credit. Also, trigger warning on this one, as we are not only talking about murder, but suicide is mentioned and discussed in this video as well. If you or anyone you know are suffering from thoughts of suicide or depression, please call the suicide hotline and get help. It is never the answer. Ann Miller Kontz was born Ann Breyer in 1970 in Batavia, New York, but she grew up in a small Pennsylvania town called Spring Grove. Ann was the oldest of 3 girls in an upper middle class family. By all reports, she was a pretty girl, she was smart, and she was good at sports. When she would graduate high school, she would go on to attend Purdue University, and this is where she would meet her future husband, Eric Miller, when she was 18 years old. Eric and Ann were a lot alike in a lot of ways. They were both attractive and intelligent people, and both were chemistry students. Eric Miller was from Indiana. His family was very close, like I just said. Just like Ann, he was intelligent and attractive and loved chemistry. 48 Hours reports the following said by his sisters about him. Quote, "He was a bit mischievous," says Eric's sister Pam. "He liked to hide behind the couch when your boyfriends were over." End quote. His sister Leanne, quote, "I think Eric truly blossomed when he went to college and he got involved in biology and chemistry and research, and he found that's what he wanted to do." End quote. Everyone around Eric and Ann after they had met said the two were immediately attracted to each other. In an article by Oxygen, Eric's sister Leanne McGee told CBS's 48 Hours, quote, "I had met some of the girls he had been dating prior. I could tell there was a difference when he introduced me to Ann." End quote. Eric would propose to Ann on Valentine's Day. While in love, the two would continue on with their studies, and in 1992, they both would graduate with their master's degrees in biochemistry. In the same year, the two would marry at St. Elizabeth Catholic Church before they would move to Raleigh, North Carolina. After they would move to Raleigh, both would continue their education in biochemistry at North Carolina State University. Eric and Ann were both enrolled in PhD courses, but only one of them would end up completing their PhD. A fellow graduate student by the name of Bernie Brown would meet them at NC State and would tell WRAL News the following about the behavior seen between the two. Quote, "They were always holding hands and happy. They came in the morning together. They left together. You know, they just seemed to be the perfect couple." Ann was, I think, the more dominant of the two in the relationship. She liked to call the shots. End quote. In 1998, Eric Miller would obtain his PhD, but instead of going into a higher paying job in biochemistry like the pharmaceutical industry, he would obtain a federal grant to do pediatric AIDS research. It paid the bills, but not as much as another job would have in his field. While Ann was perfectly capable of rising to the same level of success, Her education would come to a standstill in January of 2000 when she would give birth to the couple's daughter, Claire. Trying to balance both being a mother and finishing a PhD program was just too much. With Eric being a researcher, he always had a lower paying salary, which meant the Miller family did not always get to have the nice things. Anne loved the nicer things. She did have her master's degree, so she would use this to get a high-paying position working as a research scientist for GlaxoSmithKline. This is one of the largest and top pharmaceutical companies. Now that she had a high-paying job, she would start spending money on cosmetic procedures. Per Oxygen, a forensic psychologist named Dr. Michael Teague told Snapped, quote, she had had some cosmetic surgery on her chest, and she also had lots of other kind of beauty treatments, end quote. Eric's sister would tell them, quote, her outer appearance was very important to her, how she dressed, her makeup, her hair, everything down to her fingernails and toenails, end quote. But over time, the couple was growing farther apart. It seemed after they were out of school, they had less in common at her new job and would make a bunch of new friends though. Some of these friends were men, and so she would convince Eric Miller to go bowling with a group of the guys she worked with on November 15th, 2000. I want to note that from here on out, all information will be very important, so pay close attention. So on November 15th, 2000, Eric would meet up with a man named Daryl Willard and a group of other guys who were Ann's co-workers. While out, Daryl would order a round of beers for the guys and he would hand them out. When Eric Miller would start to drink his, he would say it tasted funny. Another one of the guys just explained it away as being bowling alley beer, so it probably just wasn't as good. But Eric wouldn't end up finishing his anyway because it would end up getting spilled, but that was probably a really good thing. So not long after consuming what he did of the beer, Eric would start having terrible stomach pain and cramping, so much so that after a couple rounds of bowling, he would begin violently vomiting. This was witnessed by the men who were there that night because instead of just leaving, he would actually pull over a trash can and vomit into that so he didn't have to leave. The other guys originally thought he may have had food poisoning, but it would only get progressively worse throughout the night, and eventually Ann, his wife, would have to take Eric to the Rex hospital to be seen by doctors. They would give him a bunch of tests to try and identify and figure out what may be causing his illness, but none of that seemed to give them any answers or results that they wanted. So Eric Miller was so sick that he would not be released from the hospital until November 24th. So he went in the night of November 15th and didn't get out until November 24th. That is over a week of being in the hospital. It is almost 10 days, probably about 9 days. And that should just show you how sick this man was. Doctors would release him on the 24th as Eric seemed to be getting better. So he would go back home to his wife Ann and his daughter Claire. Unfortunately, Eric's relief would be short-lived. Only 6 days later, after he ate dinner with his wife Ann, a dinner his wife prepared, Eric would get sick again. Ann would rush him to the hospital, and this time Eric would start hallucinating so bad that he would actually have to be restrained. Eric's sister Leanne McGee would tell Snapped, quote, he literally was thrashing on the table, end quote. This time when Eric's blood work would come back from the lab, it would show that he had high levels of arsenic in his body. Sounds like some other cases we have talked about. Doctors would obviously know that this wasn't normal and somebody had to have been poisoning him because this level of arsenic you wouldn't just stumble upon. It wouldn't just be in his system. Someone had intentionally poisoned him. So according to Evil Women by John Marlowe, scientists actually said that it looked like he had been given many small regular doses the 5 months leading up to his death. The Raleigh Police Department would be called out, but by the time they would get there on December 2nd, Eric Miller had died. Eric would succumb to arsenic poisoning at approximately 2 in the morning. He was 30 years old. His mother Doris described Eric's condition a few minutes before he would pass away to 48 Hours correspondent Troy Roberts. Quote, "He was laying in his bed with a tube in his mouth because they had tried to resuscitate him. He was cold, and I wanted to take that tube out. I wanted to cover him up because he was so cold." End quote. Police would immediately begin their investigation into his death, especially because they knew someone did this to him on purpose. By all means, Eric was the epitome of health until that night at the bowling alley when all of his symptoms would begin. Typical to most cases, the spouse is who they would really start to look into, and Ann would soon become their #1 suspect. This isn't unusual. It's typical to look at the spouse first, especially in a poisoning case such as this, because it makes sense for the poisoner to be pretty close to the victim in terms of physicality when it comes to sneaking something like arsenic into something that they're ingesting. And this is exactly what District Attorney Colin Willoughby would end up saying and telling Snapped. But apparently, whenever police would try and question Ann, she would break down into tears, and she would just say that she was too distraught and she was too upset to speak to them about her husband's death. And only a few days after Eric Miller's death, Ann had hired an attorney. But it wasn't just any attorney. It was some of the most experienced and high-profile attorneys she could buy. Wade Smith and Joe Cheshire, these are the lawyers who successfully defended the Duke lacrosse players that had been accused of rape. Obviously, this would only make police more suspicious. I do want to pause and say, though, that if you are in a criminal investigation, definitely get an attorney and do not talk. It may look suspicious, but it will only protect you. So on December 4th, 2 days after Eric passed away, they would search Ann Miller's workstation at GlaxoSmithKline. Here they would find 200 milliliters of sodium chalcodylate, an arsenic compound. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Let me point out, she was a scientist. So this isn't weird that she would have access to it at work, but it becomes much more weird and much more suspicious since her husband died from arsenic poisoning. They would also find emails on her work computer indicating that she had had an affair with a man named Daryl Willard. He should sound familiar. He's the man that handed out the beers at the bowling alley. The email exchange between the two was clearly more than just friendly emails. One of them from Ann to Daryl stated the following, quote, "I never want to stop making you feel. I want to show you new things. I want to touch places in you that you knew not existed." End quote. Apparently the two had flown to Chicago for a weekend getaway, calling it a business trip, only 3 days before Eric got sick during their bowling event. The two had stayed at the Ritz-Carlton, and they apparently had stayed there and just spent a ton of money and ordered a ton of room service. Police would show up to Ann's house to talk to her about Daryl Willard, but when they would get there and she would see them and he would be mentioned, she would just run upstairs and hide in a closet. And no, I am not joking. It is in my CBS News source down below. This is something that they discussed in 48 hours. This really happened. Eric Miller's father, Varys, had opened the door to the police, and his mother, Doris, was there as well, and so they heard about this affair, and they would tell 48 hours how they felt about the situation. Quote, "I was devastated," said Doris. "I was just so hurt, and I felt Eric was so betrayed." End quote. His father, Varys, said, quote, "I got mad as hell. She has been talking to this Willard numerous times on the telephone, and the one that really put a dagger in my heart, that she talked to him for 24 minutes, 2 hours before Eric died. Don't take a rocket scientist to figure this out. Something's wrong big time." End quote. So due to this development involving Daryl Willard, Raleigh police would end up going to his home to execute a search warrant on the morning of January 21st, 2001, at the same time they were at Ann's, trying to talk to her. Per the News and Observer, here they would confiscate documents as well as 2 computers. And while the investigators were at Willard's house, a detective, Chris Morgan, would pull him aside to to try and get some information out of him. So according to the Love Murder podcast, Arsenic and Adultery, the Poisoning of Eric Miller, when Detective Morgan would at first pull Willard aside, he would say that he had nothing to do with Eric's death. He just denied it. However, Morgan did not believe this. He said he could just tell that he was hiding something. So he said to him, quote, "Daryl, I'll be honest with you. From the phone records, from the emails, I think you've been used by a woman," end quote. Morgan then said Willard would respond with, quote, "Yeah, and she did a good job of it. I can't talk to you anymore. I've got to call my lawyer," end quote. Unfortunately, the day after this interview with Daryl Willard, his wife Yvette would come home from work and she would find him dead in the garage from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. Beside him was a suicide note in which he would apologize to his family, as well as stating, quote, "Have taken no one's life save my own. The world looks black to me," he wrote. "All I can see is the smearing of my name, Peyton calls to my family, personal humiliation, and probable economic ruin," end quote. His wife Yvette would say the day that he committed suicide, he was supposed to meet with his lawyer. Daryl was very worried after the police had searched their home for arsenic. He was also worried the world would know about his affair with Ann. Daryl's wife Yvette had apparently been suspicious of the affair between Ann and Daryl for weeks before it came out, so it wasn't really a surprise to her, just more of a confirmation. This is because she said that she could tell he was attracted to Ann by the way he would talk about her versus other co-workers he worked with. She also said that Willard had been depressed before he met Ann. He just was questioning his life decisions, but when he met Ann, Yvette noticed him paying more attention to how he looked and even working out. She said by the time he went out of town with Ann, she already knew what he was going out of town for. Yvette said that Daryl was not the kind of man who was capable of murder. She also said that she believed he really thought he had a future with Ann in order to enter into an affair, as he had told her that he wasn't really sure if he loved Yvette anymore. She just really didn't think her husband could handle the public accusations, especially with his state of mind. Yvette told 48 Hours, quote, "He had made one comment to me prior to his death. He said, 'You know how to bend. You can take things. And you just bend and you keep going,' he says. 'I can't. I'll break.' And so I knew he just couldn't cope anymore," end quote. This was her last conversation with him the day after their house was searched, the day of his suicide. Quote, "I told him it was going to be a really hard day and I asked if he'd give me a hug. And he did. And I thought he was going to break my bones. He was squeezing and then I left." End quote. Yvette believes that her husband would still be here had it not been for Ann Miller. And Ann Miller, the lovely woman that she thought she was, would just start telling people that Willard was obsessed with her and basically trying to downplay the whole situation, even though there was proof that she had been having an affair. Oxygen reports that not long after Daryl Willard would commit suicide, Ann would pack up her belongings and she would move with her daughter 2 hours south to live with her sister in Wilmington, North Carolina. She had also moved on with a new man and a musician named Paul Kontz pretty fast. She would just really go on living her life while police believe she poisoned her husband. They just did not have enough evidence to arrest her at that time and make a concrete murder charge. Had they taken her to court with just what they had, it wouldn't be enough to ensure a conviction. And so she would just go on living her life like nothing was wrong. But a break would come for investigators when they looked back on an interview of when they had spoken with Yvette Willard, because she had told them that the night before her husband, Daryl Willard, died, he had talked with his attorney, Rick Gammon. The investigators had kind of just overlooked this fact at first, but then they realized this may be a lead. So it was now 2002, over a year since Daryl Willard had passed away. Gammon had apparently told him that he could be charged with attempted murder. So obviously, police would want to talk to Gammon. Detective Chris Morgan said on 48 Hours, quote, "Why is Rick Gammon telling Daryl that he could be charged? Well, it's got to be that Daryl has told Rick Gammon something." I said, "Rick, let me ask you this. When are you gonna tell us what Daryl Willard told you?" End quote. But Gammon could not tell them anything. Even though Willard had passed away, attorney-client privilege was still an active thing. He could not by law tell them what had went on between himself and Willard and what they had discussed. Yvette, Willard's wife, would even get involved and see if she could give permission and waive her spousal rights. But since it wasn't Daryl himself, it didn't work, and she couldn't. So Gammon would, however, give detectives a hint as how they could get him to spit out the information when they were having a conversation, even though he may not have done it intentionally. So Gammon told Troy Rogers, quote, "And my response to Chris was, 'Chris, you know I can't do that unless I was ordered to do that by a judge. I told Daryl Willard over and over and over again that any and everything that he told me was confidential." End quote. So what would Detective Morgan do? He would go to a judge, hoping he could get them to order Gammon to break attorney-client privilege. District Attorney Colin Willoughby would take up the case, but it would drag on for 2 years until 2004. This case would become one that would be studied by colleges and law professionals and students, as it was not a typical thing to be done. Willoughby explained, quote, "The privileges between lawyers and their clients and priests and their parishioners are probably the two most sacred, and those are probably the most difficult to go after." End quote. Even with all of the prodding by police, Gammon still didn't give the information. He didn't want the murderer to go free, but he also really believed attorney-client privilege was so important. So at one point, the court would rule Gammon had to share the information with investigators, but he would appeal this. His appeal would get overturned, and in May of 2004, the North Carolina Supreme Court would rule that the attorney would have to reveal his conversation with Daryl per Evil Women. In a case study by William Oden III, he notes, "Presiding senior resident Supreme Court Judge Stevens would order Gammon to share any relevant information, as this was highly important information to an ongoing homicide investigation into the death of Eric Miller that couldn't really be achieved by any other source." However, Judge Stevens did say that his order would not stretch the attorney-client privilege beyond its common law existence. Basically, Gammon could share some information, but nothing that would incriminate his client. So if he talked about something that Willard had told him that was not directly incriminating himself, that was fine. Per Evil Women, the following is part of what Gammon would give the police from what Willard had told him relating to Eric's hospital stay in late November. Quote, "Mr. Willard then stated that on one recent occasion, he had met Mrs. Miller in a parking lot, and they had a conversation while in an SUV, Gammon reported. He stated that during this conversation, Mrs. Miller was crying and that she had told him she had been in the hospital where Mr. Miller had been admitted. She stated to Mr. Willard that she was by herself in the room with Mr. Miller for a period of time. She then told Mr. Willard that she took a syringe and needle from her purse and injected the contents of the syringe into Mr. Miller's IV." End quote. This information would happen on May 27th, 2004. After this, everything in the case begins to move very, very quickly. So on June 2nd, Ann Miller Kontz's one attorney, Joseph B. Cheshire V, tells police that if she is charged in her husband's death, she will surrender to authorities. Basically, they know Ann did it, she knows they know, and she will just make it easy on herself and she will give herself over and just surrender. Then on September 27th, a Wake County grand jury would indict and charge Ann Miller Kontz with the first-degree murder in the death of her 30-year-old husband, Eric Miller. According to the News and Observer, the District Attorney Willoughby will drop the death penalty and says that he will not pursue it in her case. Gammon's affidavit would be read in court on December 10th, and on February 15th, 2005, a judge would agree to move Ann from the Wake County Jail to the state prison in Raleigh so she could be closer to her attorneys. The Denver Post reports that finally on November 7th, 2005, Ann Miller Kontz would plead guilty to the second-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder in the death of Eric Miller. The one she admitted in the court to have conspired with was Daryl Willard. She was 35 years old when she was sentenced to 25 to 31 and a half years in prison. Oxygen says that in a statement read by her lawyers in court, she said, quote, "I will struggle for the rest of my life with how this could have happened. I have asked God to forgive me." End quote. Ann is serving her sentence in the News Correctional Facility in Goldsboro. She is expected to be released in 2029, September of 2029, 5 years from when I recorded this video. Now, let's not forget about not only a family who lost their son, Eric Miller, but the couple's daughter, Claire. Claire lost both parents in this situation. Star News Online reported in 2007 that a court had ruled Ann could still have contact with her child who was 7 in 2007. Eric Miller's parents tried to go against her and tried to get that contact removed, but Ann is still allowed to have contact with Claire, but Claire cannot see her as person as long as the contact is initiated by the Wilsons, and the Wilsons are Ann's sister and brother-in-law who Claire was with at the time that this went on. Claire is now 24 probably, so I would be interested to know if she had any contact with her mother or if she still has any contact with her mother. I hate these cases because I hate when people, and especially parents, don't think about how what they do will affect their children. Claire's life has forever been changed, so have the lives of many others. It may be a while since Eric Miller's death, but my heart goes out to the family, and I just think Ann Miller Kontz is a very cruel woman for what she did. These things never get better. Like families can learn how to cope, but the pain never goes away. So it seems like a lot of female murderers use poison as their method, as I said before, especially arsenic. So it's not surprising that she used this because it is reported to not have much of a taste, but arsenic is not a nice death. I just want to clarify that, and I'm sure you can see that from this case. I guess people use it because it's easy to hide, but it isn't a quick thing. It's actually a quite gruesome and painful death, and it really disgusts me when people do things like this. So with that being said, that is all I have for today's video. Please make sure to hit that red subscribe button down below. If you have any case suggestions, please send them to killerconceptsvlog@gmail.com or comment them down below. You can follow me on social. All of my handles are in the description box, as well as all of my sources. And before you go, just remember that the world's most dangerous minds hide in the most unlikely places. Stay safe.